Welcome to the WSXM channel. You don't know, my name is Stefan. So, we're going to listen to Professor PLO Lumumba talk about Russia and NATO. When he speaks, whenever he speaks, it's pretty self explanatory. We don't need to comment on it, but watch it with me and then let me know what you think about it in the comment section after. Boom.
One of the most interesting things in the world in recent times has been how to deal with the two wars that are in the public domain, the Russian-Ukraine war and the Israeli-Hamas war. When you listen particularly to Western media regarding the Ukrainian and Russian war, Russia is the aggressor. Russia has committed all sins known to man. Russia has done all things. But when you listen to the same Western media as regards the Israeli Hamas war, then their tone changes. This is not to say or to justify what Hamas did on the 7th of October. But the laws of war, both in terms of humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and of course the international humanitarian law is very clear about mass punishment and about the rules of proportionality. So it is very difficult to justify one where it is now quite clear in the opinion of all reasonable men and all reasonable institutions that the Israelis have crossed the Rubicon in terms of proportionality, and at the same time to criticize the Russians almost without limitation. But that is not surprising. In matters such as these, even the truth ceases to be neutral. The truth is a casualty in such instances. And the Western media, when it is looking at Russia, it looks at Russia as an enemy that can do nothing right. And from that perspective, you understand their analysis, you understand where they are coming from, you understand the kind of fear that they have about Russia, you understand why they are saying that what is happening is in Ukraine is just a beachhead, that the intention of Russia is to expand and to occupy the entire Europe. So that is what is defining how they are looking at that war. In the case of Israel, there is also some kind of something I call historical guilt. There is a historical guilt on the part of countries such as Germany and the world because of the Holocaust. And therefore, they are very slow to condemn Israel, lest they be seen to be endorsing the elimination of Israel and repeating the kind of silence that allowed the Holocaust to take place. So Israel recognizes this, and the individuals who with one side of the mouth condemn the Russians and with the other side of the mouth praise Israel find themselves in that situation where they do not know how to relate with the truth as it is. And the truth therefore becomes a non-neutral, non-value defined term. The truth now depends on who is defining it, and that is the tragedy of the situation in which we find ourselves today. Yeah, when the war started between Russia and Ukraine, it was not even defined as war. It was action taken by Russia to protect the interest of Russians within what is the Ukrainian state. And I think from the Moscow administration, they thought that it would be concluded very quickly. That was actually the intention, that was the planning. But several years down the line, almost 2 years down the line, the war has taken a totally different trajectory. A trajectory that has seen the war being fought almost as a proxy war. We have seen the supply of arms from the United States of America and a number of European countries who hold the view that Russia is an aggressor with expansionist intentions. And we have seen a Ukrainian president who has been received in Western capitals almost as if he is the arrow's head of a longer arrow. And the appetite, in my view, for ending this war appears to be lingering in the background. In fact, when I look at the body language and even some of the pronouncements from both parties, one would see a desire to have a resolution, but it appears that nobody knows how, because from the side of Ukraine, some of the pronouncements that are being made on her behalf are almost to suggest that the Ukrainians must win the war. The Americans are on record as saying we'll only get out when we win the war, suggesting that it's not the Ukrainians who are fighting the war, but NATO is fighting the war through Ukraine. And diplomacy has indeed not yielded much. On the side of Russia, and I've been reading and rereading the speech that was made by Vladimir Putin in the year 2007 during the Munich conference, in which he said that Russia feels betrayed, that the promises that were made in 1990s that NATO would not expand have all been disregarded, and that what one sees is the increasing movement of the NATO borders through the admission of their members not only into the European Union but into the NATO alliance. So all these things come into play, with the consequence that all attempts at diplomacy are not yielding much. I've seen the leaders of China, I've seen the leader of Turkey, seen the leader of India, and seen African heads of state trying to mediate in order to create the appetite. But I think both sides, in a manner of speaking, have waded into the blood of war so deep that to go forward is as tedious as to come back. But yet, diplomacy must never stop. What, however, in my view, stands in the way of genuine diplomacy is the demands and the grandstanding that is now taking place. On the side of Ukraine, they said that the Russians must withdraw from Donbass and Donetsk and all the other territories. And in the recent past, we have seen the incursion into Kursk. And this in itself has really demonstrated that the Ukrainians are now, in a manner of speaking, getting into Russian territory with a view to gaining leverage and saying the only condition that we will accept is you give us our land and we give you back your land, and then we can get into negotiation. So it is a very difficult situation in which we find ourselves. One could be saying that we are skating on diplomatic thin ice, and it's not going to be easy going forward. The Ukrainian-Russian war, which I'm calling this war, has brought into the fore a number of players with different interests. And one must now ask, what are the interests of these players? I think from where I sit, the Russians are saying that we are a major power. We have a country in our neighborhood which is misbehaving. We have our nationals in that country, and we are going to do everything to protect our people and to protect what we consider to be our sphere of influence, and that the West must accept that that is the reality. That, in my view, is the message that I hear from Vladimir Putin. Respect us. We want to protect our territory. Make sure that you respect the undertakings, even if they were not written, about how NATO would behave toward the Russian Federation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I hear on the other side the Zelensky administration saying, we Ukrainians are no longer a part of Russia. We are saying that you have taken our Crimea, you have taken our Donbass and our Donetsk, and you are in our territory. You cannot decide for us what you think we should do. If we choose to go into the European Union and to go into NATO, it is our decision, not yours. I hear Zelensky saying that. The Americans on the other side are saying, we have an interest in controlling that part of the world. NATO, in their view, is the guarantor of peace for the Europeans. You Russians, whether they are right or not is another debate. You think that you can control your the former Soviet countries. We are not going to allow it, and we are not going to allow you to expand, and we are going to ensure that we move closer and closer to you so that we remain the dominant military power in the world. So the Americans are saying so, not as loudly as one would want them to say it, but you can read that from the subtext. In other words, the Americans are saying, we are the big kahunas in the world and we are going to remain so, and Russia is not going to dislodge us from that position. Of course, what the Americans say is what the European countries say. So it is one thing, if once you've talked about America, you've already talked about the European countries who are members of NATO. We say that war sometimes defies logic. And what I see is, courtesy of history, is that men have this inclination to forget or to have selective amnesia. When the war was prosecuted in the 1940s, culminating in the use of the atomic device in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world was shocked. And one of the reasons why, when the world met in San Francisco and created the United Nations, was to ensure that no war would ever take place. And all these treaties about non-proliferation of nuclear armaments were actually designed to ensure that nuclear weapons will never be used again. And some of the countries that were very much in the thick of war, in fact, until today, are not allowed to get into the space of nuclear armaments, such as Germany and Japan. But I see the world is beginning to forget. And one of the things that we must remember is that nuclear weapons are weapons of last resort. Because you will hear it being said that the reason why there is nuclear deterrence is because it assures mutual destruction of all its users. You use a nuclear device and the other side will respond. Is a zero-sum game where everybody will be decimated or everybody will suffer. But if one of the parties, if Russia were to feel sufficiently threatened, particularly with what one is seeing now, where the East European countries are saying that they are going to supply the Ukrainians with long-range ballistic missiles. And if these missiles were then to be used against Russia, I'm quite certain that they would not hesitate to use a device that would end the war. It would be a tragic thing. It would possibly not end the war. It would escalate the war and the entire world would suffer in some way. So everybody knows the dangers, but remember that when countries, through their leaders, are thrown into the space of desperation, they can act desperately and to the detriment of their people and the world. So never say never, simply because we said it is undesirable. You know, Africa, unfortunately, is a continent that remains disorganized and disunited, so that even our critical institutions, such as the African Union, which some have described as a toothless bulldog, have the opportunity of being in the arena of diplomacy, we are so timid as a continent that we cannot allow our voices to be heard. I personally hold the view that if there was a strong African Union, because the relationship between Russia and Africa is not bad, efforts could be made of a very useful kind to bring President Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky on the table and to persuade them to have direct negotiation, because direct negotiation sometimes can yield fruits that many people think cannot even be produced. But unfortunately, that is not going to happen, because as a continent, we are divided and also susceptible to manipulation by different world powers. So the African Union may exist there symbolically, but countries will operate as if they were running their own solo affairs, and therefore diplomatically Africa is a weakling which is incapable of playing serious role in the world arena. I would have thought in this regard that countries such as India and China, if they were serious, they could actually do a lot. India and China have the capacity, if they acted in a united way, to actually bring pressure to bear on the players in this regard. I'm saying this because China is a nuclear power, India is a nuclear power, and given their economies, which are rising by the day, their voices can be heard a lot more loudly if they chose to play a role that is a lot more proactive. Unfortunately, they are also walking with velvet feet. You know, as we talk about diplomacy, it must also not be lost to us that the United States is facing a defining election in the month of November that is pitting the usual combatants, namely the Republicans and the Democrats. And in a very unique way, the United States of America now has a major party, the Democrats, fielding a lady, Kamala Harris. And of course, there is also Donald Trump, who is trying to have a second bite at the cherry, having lost to Joe Biden. My view is, one, that from the rhetoric I'm hearing from Donald Trump, if he were to win the elections, there would be some attempt at stopping the war. He's pronounced it himself that he would make every effort to ensure that the war ends. Whether he will be allowed by the American political system to do that is another debate. But if we remember that during his first presidency, he was very clear in redefining the relationship of America and its NATO partners. We will remember that he had a much more cordial relationship with Vladimir Putin. And in that regard, one therefore can take the view that a Republican presidency in the year 2025 may bring the Ukrainian and Russian war to some kind of table of negotiation. On the other hand, if Kamala Harris were to win the elections, one can speculate that having served as the president of Joe Biden, who has been very hawkish in his rhetoric and in his actions as regards the war in Ukraine, that nothing will change. They will simply say, we want this war prosecuted until the Russians actually capitulate, which is not going to happen. The Russians are not going to raise the white flag and say we have surrendered and we will accept whatever terms that are defined by NATO. So it is an interesting situation, and one cannot speculate too much and too far. One wants to wait until January, which is not too far, to see what will happen in terms of that particular war in that part of the world between Ukraine and Russia. You know, the war in Ukraine and American involvement is one that raises critical questions. One of the critical questions is whether there are any risks that are posed to the United States of America. And one can talk about risks in many ways. First of all is the geostrategic risks. The geostrategic risks are risks that are defined by the United States of America seeing the diminution of its power in the world. That as a country which has been the major power, the hegemon after the World War II, it wants to continue in that space. And therefore, when the United States of America is seeing a world that is becoming much more multilateral with different voices, it fears that its influence will reduce and wane, and that countries such as Russia will then occupy some space which was occupied by the United States and or its allies, as we have seen in a number of countries in the Sahelian region. So geostrategically, there is that risk. There is also the other thing, simply world economics, that if you allow countries such as Russia with the major resources, and we know that Russia has been the engine of the supply, and I'm using the word engine very deliberately, of supply of gas and other resources to Western Europe, you want to curtail that so that the pipe that feeds the Russian economy is cut, and economically it becomes just another country. So America also sees itself as being threatened by a stronger Russia, indeed as it is threatened by a stronger China and a stronger India. So from that world trade, from the trade position, the Americans fear that their influence is reducing by the day. But remember that the war can take different faces. And as we have seen, war can now be prosecuted without the use of men and women and their boots on the ground. So, inasmuch as they think that the war cannot touch the soil of the United States of America, in these days of artificial intelligence, if you push countries too hard, then you never know where the war can end. And I think to that extent, when America or indeed other countries are engaging in these proxy wars, they must always be reminded that technology can now spread wars to the detriment of a population in a manner that has not been anticipated, and that therefore what is critical is that the world must embrace diplomacy and peace. Easier said than done, but I think that one of the things is that we must morally rearm ourselves, and we must be warriors for peace through diplomacy, where there is no winner or vanquished.
So that was Professor PLO Lumumba. When he speaks, it doesn't need no explanation. It's self-explanatory. So let me know what in the comment section what you guys think about what you just watched. Thanks. Boom.